Hey guys, so today we are doing the Cold War. Before I start, I just want to say that I might go a little bit out of order, but you'll follow along easily. Anyway, stay tuned. The structure of the UN. So after World War II, an international body was formed in April 1945. Yeah, I was right. Okay. Oh, I was right. Yes. Okay. And it was known as the United Nations. This international body discussed world issues and came up with solutions for those world problems or issues or whatever you want to call them. It consisted of the General Assembly, which includes representatives from all member nations, and each representative got one vote. It also consisted of the Security Council of 15 member nations, where only 5 were permanent. That included the United States, Russia, France, Great Britain, and China. A division of Germany and the Berlin Airlift. I'm mixing these two together. In 1948, the Western Allies wanted to merge their zones of occupation in Germany. However, the Soviets, they were like, nah, boy, you can't merge your zones. And they reacted by closing all railroads and highways to Berlin. To avoid war, the Allies started a massive airlift, the Berlin Airlift, to feed and supply the city Berlin. After 1 year, the Soviets lifted the blockade, seeing that it was pointless because they had this blockade, but the Allies still were getting past it anyway, so it was a waste of time. But then in 1949, the Western zone succeeded in merging and became an independent nation called the Federal Republic of Germany. And the Soviets responded by turning their zone into a nation called German Democratic Republic. So West Germany became the Federal Republic of Germany, and East Germany became the German Democratic Republic. That's the main thing here. The Iron Curtain and satellite states, I'm mixing these together. But anyway, although he promised to, Stalin did not hold any free elections in Germany. He was supposed to, but he lied and he didn't. Instead, the Soviet army set up puppet governments in Eastern Europe and forced these puppet governments to become communist and forced these puppet governments to follow Soviet Union's their policies, laws, whatever. The puppet governments became Soviet satellites, and Stalin sort of got away with this with the excuse that these satellite states were to protect the Soviet Union from invasion. Now, so the satellite states, boom, because of the satellite states, Winston Churchill, remember that British guy? I'm sorry, guys. He's British. The little top hat. Just remember, that's how I remember him. Anyway, he then declared that an Iron Curtain had descended on Europe, meaning that trade between Western and Eastern and Western and Eastern, however you want to, trade had been cut off between Eastern and Western Europe. Now, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. So in 1949, the U.S., Canada, and 10 Western nations formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So that's what NATO stands for, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to protect Western Europe from communist aggression. In 1955, the Soviet Union responded to NATO by forming the Warsaw Pact with its Eastern European allies. So NATO was all the Western nations who were against communism, basically. So that's that. And then the Warsaw Pact was the opposite of that, I should say, because the Soviet Union and their Eastern allies, they're opposites. Does that help you remember it? I don't know. But yeah. The Marshall Plan was announced in 1947, and it built future trading partners for the U.S. and helped the Europeans resist communism by giving billions of dollars to aid Western European nations. So, if I were to sum this up, the Marshall Plan was the U.S. giving other nations money to help them, not only with the post-World War II stuff, but also resisting communism. So yeah, money. That's how you confirm. Yo. Okay, wait. So Marshall Plan money. Marshall Plan money. That's I'm good. Sometimes I'm good. The Truman Doctrine was United States aid to all people who wanted to resist communism, right? So if a country wanted to go against communism and resist it, they'd pretty much automatically have U.S. support. Which brings me to containment. So containment was America's policy that said that although the U.S. wouldn't try and overturn communism in places where it already existed, they would still try to stop the spread of communism to other countries. So containment, they don't want it to spread to the Western nations. They want it just to leave it to how it is. They don't want more nations to become communist. That's containment. This guy over here is Nikita Khrushchev. He came to power after Stalin's death in 1953. He was a communist who wanted peaceful competition in the West. This guy over here is Mao Zedong. He was a communist leader in China. After World War II, the communists gained control of China and formed two Chinas, Mao's Communist China and Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist China in Taiwan. The Great Leap Forward was an economic and social campaign led by Mao Zedong that focused on transforming China into a socialist society by rapidly industrializing and modernizing. It failed, however, and led to economic crisis, causing famine. Ooh, gotta turn that paper. Okay. The Cultural Revolution. In 1962, Mao put down Khrushchev's reforms in the Soviet Union, which created disagreements between China and the Soviet Union. He announces the Cultural Revolution to hide his mistakes of the Great Leap Forward and to re-motivate revolutionary movements. Mao gathered 11 million students to meet in Beijing as Red Guards, but eventually violence broke out and the Red Guard got out of control. The increasing violence caused the Cultural Revolution to end. The Korean War. So in 1945, Korea divided into two different states. North Korea, a communist state, and South Korea. Did you hear that? Anyway. And South Korea, a non-communist state. In 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, and due to the containment policy, the United Nations and the U.S. became involved to help South Korea. American entry caused Communist China to enter and help North Korea. In 1953, the Korean War ended in a stalemate, which means that neither side won. The 38th parallel was reestablished as the border between North Korea and South Korea. North Korea remained communist, and South Korea remained non-communist. Okay, so the Vietnam War was very similar to the Korean War. Vietnam divided into a communist North and a democratic South. Ho Chi Minh was the leader of communist North Vietnam, who received aid from China and the Soviet Union. The Viet Cong was a group of South Vietnamese communists that supported the North. So even though they lived in the democratic South, they still supported the communist North. They were communists that lived in the South. Can't stop the video. I have more. Turn the page. Great job, Jenna. Anyway, so North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam, and the U.S. provided aid for South, and at first they were only like advisors, but by 1964, American troops were in like full-on engaged like military action, all that. And under President Richard Nixon in the 1970s, the U.S. troops left Vietnam, causing South Vietnam to fall to communism. This is a big loss for the Western nations because this whole time they're trying to stop the spread of communism, and they really didn't. But in the U.S., there were a lot of protests going on because they were being defeated. I know for a fact, my great uncle, Rob, he fought in the Vietnam War, and even to this day, he has trouble talking about it because it was a lot of U.S. soldiers died due to Vietnam, and we were losing. So finally, when Richard Nixon in the 1970s, they, pulled out of there, and they left, and South Vietnam fell to communism. The Khmer Rouge / Pol Pot, that's where we're up to. The Khmer Rouge was a Cambodian communist group that took control in 1975. Pol Pot was the Khmer Rouge leader, and he killed his political opponents and city dwellers. However, Vietnam intervened, and Cambodia fell to communism. Cuban Missile Crisis. Fidel Castro became the dictator of Cuba in 1959 and eventually turned Cuba into a communist state, posing a threat to spread communism to other areas in Latin America. In 1962, Castro and Khrushchev began to build Soviet Cuba and installed missiles that contained nuclear weapons. This posed a threat to the U.S., being that Cuba is very close to Florida. President John F. Kennedy ordered a naval blockade of Cuba, threatening to invade if the Cuban missiles were not removed. For about 2 weeks, the world was at the brink of a nuclear war. Khrushchev eventually agreed to, take out the missiles, and the U.S. agreed to not invade Cuba. Hungary, 1956. So, Hungary's leaders threatened to leave the Warsaw Pact, and they wanted freedom. However, in 1956, the Soviet Union basically shut them up really fast and violently put down the government, the reform government. And then Czechoslovakia in 1968, Czech leaders created a policy called Communism with a Human Face, which was a more liberal policy, but the Soviets sent military forces in and replaced the leadership with communists. They're very similar. So Detente was a U.S. policy to put pressure on North Vietnam, and it ended up relaxing tensions between the U.S. and Soviet Union. Nixon and Soviet leaders signed the SALT Accord agreement, which limited the number of nuclear weapons, and in 1972, Nixon restored diplomatic relations with Communist China. Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. In 1979, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in an attempt to force Afghanistan into a communist state, which shattered the U.S. and Soviet peace that they had. The U.S. aided Afghanistan and eventually defeated the Soviets. Poland and Solidarity. In the 1980s, Lech Walesa formed an independent trade union called called Solidarity. In 1989, Poland held free elections and Solidarity won, making Poland the first non-communist nation, or government I should say, in Eastern Europe since World War II. Now we're up to Gorbachev, and he was the leader of the Soviet Union who promoted Glasnost, which is the openness to democratic ideas, and Perestroika, which is reshaping the economy and government. So the fall of the Berlin Wall. That rhymed. We should write poetry. We should write AP World Poetry. Anyway, so in 1989, after the East German communist government resigned, the Berlin Wall was knocked down, and free elections were held, making East Germany a non-communist government who cooperated with Western Germany. So it was a big deal for the Western nations who were against communism because communism was no more in Germany. Anyway. In 1989, students peacefully demonstrated in Beijing's Tiananmen Square and demanded greater freedom and democracy, refusing to break up. Deng Xiaoping, China's leader at the time, ordered tanks to fire on them, killing hundreds of students. The dissolution of the Soviet Union. In August 1991, the communists tried to overthrow the government and tried to stop reforms. However, it lacked support and collapsed, causing the Communist Party that supported it to be discredited. In December 1991, Belarus. I'm so sorry. I don't know how to pronounce it. Okay. Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine declared independence and formed the new Commonwealth of Independent States. And the former Soviet Union was dead. No more Soviet Union after 1991. No more. It's done. And lastly, problems in the former communist world. After achieving liberation from the Soviet Union's control, the Eastern Europeans struggled with things like the transition to market economies, fragile democracies, severe pollution, and rivalries between nationalist groups that caused conflict and violence. So the huge change, different governments in all the history always makes problems for the government. But that was for this. And yeah. That was a weak way to end a video. I am so sorry. That was it for today, guys. I hope it was informational or helpful, I should say. Sorry it wasn't as funny as yesterday's video, but I'll see you tomorrow. Bye!